Well, why don't I welcome everyone on behalf of the Hiroshima Nagasaki Peace Committee. And this is, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's the 43rd annual Hiroshima Remembrance. Is that right, Ellen?
I believe it's the
43rd or
44th.
44th one would have been in 1981. And so people might wonder, why are we meeting on August 5th instead of August 6th? Because we all know the bomb was dropped on the 6th. And the answer has to do with Albert Einstein. And he made a comment about the bomb. And he may have been talking about Trinity. I think he was talking about Hiroshima. But the quote went something like this: in that instant that the bomb was detonated, in that instant, everything changed except for the way that we think. And thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. And he said that back in the 1940s, back at the beginning. And I think it's interesting when you look at Einstein, the Manhattan Project, the bomb would not have happened had Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard and several other atomic scientists become aware that the about research that was being done in France, primarily having to do with the theoretical possibility of an atomic bomb. And so they were very concerned that Hitler's scientists, Heisenberg and others, the Germans had tremendous physicists, and they were concerned that the German scientists would get the bomb. And so Einstein drafted a letter, and took that letter to Roosevelt. And out of that letter came the Manhattan Project. And of course, as we know, out of that came the atomic bomb. So that's the reason why we remember it on August the 5th. And we always do. And also for those who are in the DMV area, the District, Maryland, and Virginia area, on August the 8th, we will be having a candlelight vigil at the White House at 9:45 p.m. And we'll be having a moment's silence remembering Nagasaki, and we'll have an informal circle to give our thoughts about the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and where we are today. And I think that really is the key. The discussion today needs to come back, and especially I think when we have the question and answer period, let's try to focus on the reality that today we are as close as we've ever been to global nuclear catastrophe. For 2 years now, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has had the doomsday clock set to 90 seconds to midnight. And that's the closest it's ever been. That's closer than it was in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the reason for that is multifold. One has to do with the fact that back when the doomsday clock was first organized, the issue, the existential issue, was nuclear annihilation. And today we have another existential threat, which is the threat of climate change. And just right now, as we're speaking, we're looking at 3 feet of rain in North Carolina because of a hurricane. We're looking at just last week, the hottest week on Earth in history. All kinds of warnings. As we're speaking today, the temperature in Antarctica is 50 degrees above where it should be. So these are all warning signs. So this is an existential threat. And so that they have incorporated the threat of climate change, environmental destruction into the doomsday clock framework. The other issue is, well, of course, we're looking at 2 major conflicts that are going on, one of which is essentially bringing 2 nuclear superpowers face to face. and the other has a very close potential. As we're speaking, United States warships are streaming into the Mediterranean off the coast of Israel. There have been assassinations, there have been attacks on embassies, there have been rocket attacks on all sides, and so that's the reality. As we're speaking today, the stock market crashed over 1,000 points, one of the 10 or 12 largest drops in the history of the stock market, percentage-wise, and I think fourth or fifth in terms of the number of points. And all of these issues, in my opinion, are interconnected. And what makes them important is all of these things. Michael Clare talked about resource wars, a great book he published about 10 or 12 years ago. And he talked about how as we're depleting our resources, that regional conflicts will develop because the resources are limited. And so there are inevitably going to be conflicts. One interesting statistic that I read just yesterday, is that since the year 2000, in 24 years, the world has consumed substantially more non-renewable resources than it had in the entire history of humanity before that. So the entire history of humanity up until the year 2000 has now been exceeded in the last 24 years. And so we're lowering the threshold to nuclear war in area after area after area. And in the meantime, we have basically obliterated every single major arms control agreement that were excruciatingly negotiated and approved since the beginning of the arms race. So the many scientists, many of us have said and long said and fought really hard for the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And the idea was very simple, and that, we essentially have Nixon and Kissinger to thank for that, and Brezhnev, maybe, I think it was Brezhnev was the Soviet co-signer. But the ABM treaty, the idea is that if you have an anti-ballistic missile system, then theoretically that you could launch first, take out most of your opponent's nuclear weapons, and then mop up afterwards. And so it was encouraging a first strike. And so the consensus was, and the agreement was, and it lasted for almost 25 years, and that was to basically, with a few exceptions around capitals and maybe one or two others, was to ban anti-ballistic missile systems. And it worked, but then George W. Bush abrogated that treaty in the early 2000s. So that was the bedrock treaty. That was really the important one. But we also negotiated the INF treaty that happened a little bit later. That happened under Reagan and Gorbachev. And the idea there was, and so my friend Christopher up in Canada, it was our Canadian sisters and brothers that did a lot of the really heavy organizing, and our sisters, of course, in Great Britain, that did a lot of the heavy organizing against the United States sending cruise missiles and Pershing missiles to Great Britain. And so here in Washington, D.C., we had a die-in for peace, including a Grim Reaper, and we had one of our characters, Paul the Peace Walker, actually went to a butcher shop and bought some hot dogs, some old-fashioned hot dogs, and so he dressed up as a cannibal and was eating the hot dogs, pretending that they were people. And so this was for the benefit of the media. So this is the kind of work that we've done. But of course, the point is that INF treaty is gone, thanks to President Trump. And with the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty is gone. And that was important because it permitted our inspectors to go to Russia, to the Soviet Union, and then to Russia, and Soviet and then Russian inspectors to come to the US and to verify Reagan's famous trust but verify. So that was what Open Skies was. So now we are left, essentially, we are left with a treaty that was negotiated under Obama. It was called New START. It was not a major treaty by any means, but it was, I mean, it was significant because it did reduce, weapons, and it was one of the tools that we used to get from 70,000 down to 10,000 or 12,000 or wherever we are today. And so that's the only real major treaty other than the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which also has very serious issues, as any of us who are longtime activists can explain if anybody wants to ask later on. So the point is, and the New START Treaty is expiring in January of 2026. So in a year and a half, that's going to expire. So there's not going to be any negotiations, nuclear arms agreements at all. And then the other thing is that even at the height of the Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you had the red line, you had the red phone, the direct connection, and the evil empire was on the phone all the time talking with the Pentagon, and there was communication back and forth. In spite of all the rhetoric and all the demonization, today it's not clear at all for me, and maybe someone can correct me on this, but it's not clear to me that there's really any meaningful communication going on. So all of these things put together are the reason why many of us have been calling on the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists to move the clock even closer to midnight. There needs to be a change. Literally, I mean, I wake up in the morning and kind of pinch myself and say, well, I'm still here. I mean, that's kind of where my head is at. And the media has, to say the least, the media has not done their job in terms of communicating the nuclear situation, nor, in my opinion, have they done anything like an adequate job educating the public about the climate crisis, and I think importantly, what is going to need to be done in order to address the climate crisis, and what are the implications if we do not address the climate crisis. And so one of the prominent books on my bookshelf is a book written by Barry Commoner. It's called The Closing Circle, and he talked about how the window is closing in terms of the environment, and I would say that same analogy applies to nuclear weapons, and that the window is closing in terms of opportunities to change the current paradigm that is, as Einstein said, is driving us toward unparalleled catastrophe. So having said that, what I would like to do, I'm looking through the list, but I want to recognize for about 10 minutes or so, Hideko Tamura, our guest. She's an activist with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She was 10 years old in Hiroshima when the bomb is dropped. So Hideko, in about 15 minutes, we're going to be stopping and we're going to be having a minute of silence. So if for the next 10 minutes or so you'd like to give your testimony, I'm going to mute myself and listen. Thank you. Tamura-san, you have to unmute yourself.
She has unmuted herself. She just wasn't speaking. I think she was just taking a moment.
Okay, she is unmuted.
Yeah, she's unmuted. She just wasn't speaking.
You want me to start speaking now?
Yes, for about 10 minutes or so, if you would do that, please. Thank you.
Okay, what do you want me to speak on?
I just want you to reflect on the introduction and reflect on your experiences in Hiroshima and maybe some of your wisdom about what you think what we should be doing, those of us who are still out there fighting for nuclear abolition. So just your thoughts.
Southern Oregon and California had extreme heat. And, you know, I've always connected my Hiroshima experience when the summer temperature rose to scorching heat. So I'm afraid I'm a little bit exhausted from being exposed to extreme heat every day at this point. But let me say, first of all, dropping of this weapon had a long history. And, you know, somebody said something about Truman. Truman didn't even know until Roosevelt died and he took over the job of being the president. So, you know, he had really nothing to do conceiving and making this plan. It was Roosevelt. Anyway, in the wartime, your interest is preservation of your own side and on your own lives. No matter how you put it, you know, some people just spoke of dropping of the bomb as saving lives. And our first thought was, whose lives? It didn't make sense to us. Anyway, from my own recollection of being inside of the mushroom cloud, it is pitch dark, absolutely no light. And when I think of it, it's symbolic. It's gone back into the space of the time of the big bangs. That's where it will take us. Whatever the civilization achieved, it took us to dropping it, to overcome the lives of other side. So let's just not save anything to do with saving lives. We are saving the lives of the Americans when you dropped it. Okay. On the other hand, some of you really, from the beginning, expressed concern and stood up that this should not be a kind of a weapon that should be around. We must agree that people in Hiroshima had no idea what came down until MacArthur left and we learned what it was. We became the subject of study. Specimens were taken, drawn, and were called to the Atomic Casualty Commission Center and studied closely. But all the notes and the record gathered there, MacArthur forbade being published and remained in Japan. It was part of the military secret. He took them all out. So until quite some time later, we hadn't understood exactly what it was that killed us, burned alive and melted, or without any scar on your body, suddenly you can breathe. And when we learned it was the power of the radiation, we understood a little bit better. Now, with you guys here participating in this subject, helped a great deal in maintaining 79 years. It's a long time, close to a century, without anyone else dying from the explosion of the bomb dropped on them, although there have been a lot of casualties from testing in the Pacific or downwinders where the Trinity explosion took place. I think that is a remarkable record, and we owe it to you to thank that this was possible, because you are the people who stood and made observations and urged commitment for not allowing this to go on in whatever individual style difference. In the meantime, in Hiroshima and in Japan, we had had tremendous hardships on the military, carrying on war, starved ourselves. When Hiroshima happened, people were starving. There was not enough food. And lo and behold, the United States started sending us food. This, of course, urged also by the emperor, who was a symbolic head of our country, which, in spite of its smallness, an assault from the continental to the north of us Koreans, the Chinese, the Mongols, try to take us and swallow us in. But for 3,000 years, we kept defending our culture in a small island called Japan. Now, I'm really very pleased. I was born a Japanese and raised in Japanese culture. I love tea ceremony. I love Japanese dancing. I've taken classes and lessons, also in flower arranging. And there are many ways the Japanese really enjoy the depth of being a human and observing what beauty there is in the nature and in our own making, in spite of the fact that we acted very poorly, taking on, I don't know what possessed the military to even begin to take on the United States. But they did, and we suffered from it, and we ended in a very horrific way. First, uranium bomb in Hiroshima. Secondly, plutonium bomb in Nagasaki. Uranium clears very quickly, but the plutonium doesn't. So 30 or some years after the bomb, Nagasaki water reserves still have remnants of radiation, and they were being affected. Anyway, let these be clearly the evidence of you must not do it again. Thank you. And those of you who are present helped keep it from happening, making observations, participating in memorial, participating in their own fashion, lantern float, looking to help. To me, the pitch dark in the inside of mushroom cloud that I was in There was absolutely no way anything could be discerned. In the darkness that went on, I thought it would go forever and ever, but I think it went about 15 minutes. And then when the dust settled, there was a faint, small crack of light coming in as the sky must have cleared, and the Enola Gaze was long gone. I was able to crawl and come out of it. Thank you that those two symbolic things, pitch dark, wiped out civilization, and then a faint little light coming through that we could scroll, crawl, and come out, and did what we did, escaping or trying to, and subjected to becoming human being living with death that Jay Lifton called and wrote. As a young psychiatrist from Yale, studying 50 survivors, and said we were all walking around with death. Thank you.
Thank you, Hideko, for your inspirational words. It is your tireless, the Hibakusha tireless devotion to traveling all over the world to give your testimony. Here in Washington, D.C., the first Hibakusha delegation that we welcomed was in 1983. And since then, every year until the COVID pandemic hit, we welcomed a Hibakusha delegation here. And most years we would welcome 3 or 4 or more Hibakusha delegations. And we also would work with volunteers in New York City every 5 years. When the NPT review would come, we would organize forums from the year 2000 until the year 2015. Every year, we raise money here to send youth, high school youth, college youth, to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to meet with the Hibakusha, to hear their story, and to participate in the World Conference. So I want you to know that you are an inspiration to us. Nihon Dankyo and all of the Hibakusha are an inspiration to us, and we're so happy that you could take the time to be with us and to give us this truly, truly inspirational message.
Thank you very much. And I must say, just right away, I received the compassion of the American missionaries who rushed over to Hiroshima and then tried to understand and give us support. And I benefited very, very much from the concerns and the compassion and the support of the American individuals. That's why I'm in this culture.
So thank you very much. And we're going to be having our moment of silence here in about a minute. But following that moment of silence, I'm actually going to go out of order, and I'm going to recognize Mel Hardy so he can talk about some of the work that the children of Washington, D.C. and the All Souls Church did to support the children at the Ground Zero School in Hiroshima, Japan. So, but first it is 7:15 p.m., which is 8:15 a.m. August 6th, Japan time. So this is the moment that the bomb was dropped. So what we're going to do is we're going to have about 3 minutes of silence. So I'm going to mute myself, and let's all think about Hideko's message as we remember Hiroshima. Thank you, everybody, for the moment's silence. Before I ask Mel to speak for 3 or 4 minutes, Mel, I'd like to go back to what Tamura-san said. She talked about MacArthur leaving, and then when MacArthur left the occupation, the Japanese people learned about what had happened. And what she's talking about is a draconian censorship campaign. So any reference to the atomic bombing was ruthlessly suppressed by the occupation forces. And one of the most extreme examples was the fact that immediately after the bombing, Japanese physicians went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and identified the radiation sickness, and they quickly became the world's greatest experts in how to treat radiation sickness. And many of them wrote down, what they were doing, what treatments were successful, what treatments were not successful. The occupation government went in to these doctors' offices and confiscated all their notes, so that knowledge was suppressed and lost. And who knows how many thousands and tens of thousands of the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki died because they were, denied treatment because the U.S. government censored it. So I wanted to just give that as an example. This is something we could talk about. We could do a whole program on this issue alone. But having said that, I'm going to go out of order, and I'm going to ask Mel Hardy briefly to talk about the All Souls children's drawings, and particularly, I don't know if Tamura-san is aware of this, but I think we have a lot of special guests, and they need to hear this story. So, Mel, can you briefly tell the story?
Yes, very briefly, John, and thank you very much for this. And thank you very much for your leadership on this annual remembrance of the atrocities wrought, but also of the reverence that we give to the Hibakusha who are still with us, who provide that beaconage around hope for a world free from nuclear weapons. The story of the Hiroshima children's drawings is one of a story of two points of departure. One of compassion, maybe institutional compassion or personal, and the other is one of hope. After one of General MacArthur's education consultant, a guy named Howard Bell, was assigned to Hiroshima, and upon the discovery of a school in Hiroshima, Hankawa Elementary School, he wrote back to a church, happened to be All Souls Church at 16th and Harvard Street, Northwest in Washington, D.C. He had been there before, had met with Reverend A. Powell Davies, who wrote a major sermon in the aftermath of the war, both immediately thereafter and also in December of 1945. But he wrote back to the church and said, listen, there's this school that's bombed out. The building still exists, but there are no windows. These kids are sitting on planks of wood to try to do their schoolwork. Could you help them by sending any kind of materials to them for their schooling? That did happen. The religious education department of also Church Unitarian put together a container load of materials, papers, pencils, crayons, watercolors, baseball caps, American ephemera, American cultural materials, sent it over. And then 2 years later, what came back was a set of drawings, 48 of them. We now know that apparently about 96 of them were executed by these children, the children's drawings, the Hiroshima children's drawings. Some of them went to Hawaii, and some of them went back to Washington, D.C., to All Souls Church. Those works are the beacon of hope. They're distinctively different from other Hiroshima drawings because of the application of color, the visual vocabulary that the children use, the execution that is very precocious, well beyond the years of their ages between 8 and 12 years old, and the skill level. It's really fantastic work. We have taken those, after 65 years in 2010, Shizumi Manali, whose mother was born in Hiroshima, she identified a number of the artists who painted those images 65 years old earlier. We took them back to Hiroshima. We met with 19 of those artists. We had an exhibition at the Hankawa Elementary School and the museum that's attached to the Hankawa School, and had an exhibition there. It is the church's, All Souls Church's effort in partnership with the Hiroshima Nagasaki Peace Committee to uh, maintain our relationship with the Japanese people and those people who are Hubakushu, whose friendship we desperately need, whose language we desperately need to advance a world without nuclear weapons. Ellen has put forth on the screen images of those Hiroshima children's drawings. We honor that you do that. Thank you so very much. These images are always on view at All Souls Church. Anyone who wants to see them have the enhanced reproductions of those works hanging. We have them in a storage facility, a protected storage facility, so that they can remain in posterity. So thank you very much, John. There's so much more to say. There's a documentary film, pictures from Hiroshima schoolyard. It is available online. You can see both the trailer and the full-length 58-minute movie that documents the story of the relationship between and the origin story of these Hiroshima children's drawings. So, John, thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this commemorative, and we all work for a world free of nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Mel. So now we're going to go back to the program. So we have three presenters. We have Gwen DuBois, who's the president of Chesapeake Physicians for Social Responsibility, Linda Gunter, who is the founder of Beyond Nuclear, and Fan Yang, who is a young activist from the Global South representing WILPF. And so Fan wrote me and said, well, you know, I mean, my background is economics. I work in international economics, and I'm really not an expert on nuclear issues. And I responded and I said, no. We don't want your expertise. We want your feelings and your attitudes. You're a young person. You're a young woman from the Global South. And we need to hear that perspective. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to start with Gwen. And Gwen Gwen, you're co-host, so you can share your screen. I know you have a PowerPoint. And so Gwen is going to give us a little primer on the bomb. And then next we're going to have Linda talk. And Linda's going to talk about the actual human suffering and the environmental issues around the bomb. And then we're going to have Fan Yang is going to be our final presenter, and she's going to talk about, you know, her perspective on nuclear abolition and her thoughts about, you know, paths forward. So why don't we start with Gwen? So Gwen, take it away.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And listen, this is a very erudite audience, so I may be telling you stuff you know, and you can tell me, go faster, or leave that out. But anyway, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. I believe the more we all understand about how terrible these weapons are, the more we're likely to be committed to nuclear abolition. Helping to prevent nuclear war is the gift we can leave our children and all those who come after us. There are three aims to this talk. What are nuclear weapons? And what are the medical consequences of their use? And I always talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki because, you know, almost like a religion, we must talk about what happened. And then can we prevent nuclear war and abolish nuclear weapons? So a hydrogen bomb combines a chemical explosive to compress fissionable uranium or plutonium. The fission releases massive amounts of energy in the form of X-rays, which create the high temperature and pressure needed to ignite fusion. And bombs are not just fission fusion, they're fission fusion fission. I mean, what were these people thinking? How much destruction did they want to do? So the temperature at the center of the explosion could be several times that of the temperature at the core of the sun, as high as 100 million degrees centigrade, where all matter is turned into gas. This heats and lights up the surrounding air and creates the fireball, which is formed in a millionth of a second and is gone in less than a minute, but it triggers the three destructive forces of the explosion, the thermal, the blast, and the nuclear radiation, and gives rise to the mushroom cloud. The fireball emits large amounts of heat and light, and that lasts no more than 20 seconds, with temperatures on Earth several thousand degrees Celsius. It causes first, second, and third degree burns. These are called flash burns in the skin of those exposed to unshielded, and flash blindness in the eyes of those who look at the rising fireball. It will also burn the surface of buildings and trees, ignite fires for material that is combustible, including paper, curtains, bedding, for example, ignited through a window in the path of the thermal pulse. The flame burns refer to the burns people sustain being caught in burning buildings. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 95% of those who survived the first 2 hours had burns, and more than 50% of fatalities, that's 40,000 deaths in each city, were due to a small atomic bomb. Quote, there were the shadowy forms of people, some who looked like walking ghosts, others moved as though they were in pain, like scarecrows. The people who were burned suffered more because of the skin peeled away, glistening raw wounds were exposed to the heat and the filth. This is from Hiroshima Diary. I'll probably pronounce his name wrong, Dr. Hakiya. It's very much worth reading. It was written, I think, in 1954. The blast effects. The rapid expansion of fireball with a thin, dense shell made of gaseous residues of the bomb severely compresses the surrounding atmosphere, creating a front with its crushing overpressures greater than atmospheric pressure and dragging behind it very high winds. The overpressure crushes and collapses buildings, and the winds turn objects from collapsing buildings and debris such as shards of glass into flying missiles. Anything not tied down, including people and animals, is picked up and thrown around before landing back on the ground. The rubble created by the crushing overpressures and the tornado force winds promote the development of fires. The left upper panel, the house is lit up and begins to burn from the thermal pulse. On the right side shows the building collapsing from the blast. The third effect is acute radiation. This is pictures from Nagasaki. This 21-year-old soldier was less than a kilometer from ground zero. He's showing the marrow damage with these bleeding spots called petechia from radiation-induced bone marrow damage. This occurred within a month of the explosion and portended a terrible prognosis. Though he was initially fine after the explosion, he looks terrified as if he knows he will die soon. And people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not understanding radiation, knew the import of these terrible signs of the petechiae on their skin. Whether from the initial bomb or from the radioactive fallout deposited in hotspots by the mushroom cloud, the lethality of the radioactivity depends on the dose received over a short period of time. Now, as John mentioned, we really don't know the full number of deaths. There's really no precise data. Burns predominated in both cities, and total deaths were greater in Hiroshima because of the firestorm there. But ordinary citizens certainly did not have cameras. The healthcare system was in ruins. And as mentioned, the supreme commander for Allied powers controlled Japan after the war and censored anything to do with the bomb. And finally, Hibakusha, who were discriminated against, were sometimes reluctant to disclose their experience with the bomb. In Hiroshima, 88% of the nurses, 90% of the doctors were dead or injured, and 80% of the hospitals were destroyed or severely damaged and not available for help. This we know based on the journal from Dr. Marcel Junot from the ICRC. He's the first foreign doctor to reach Hiroshima after the atomic bomb attack. He ends his journal with an appeal for the bomb to be banned outright, such as poison gas was outlawed after the aftermath of World War I. Once the bomb is dropped on a city, there's no meaningful help possible for the victims. Prevention is the only option. Consider Hiroshima, where the firestorm started after 30 minutes, asphyxiating and burning its victims. And we didn't know then, it's even worse, we didn't know then the nuclear war was worse than we thought. Soot lofted into the stratosphere from burning cities after regional nuclear war, and much worse after a global nuclear war, could drop temperatures below freezing, even in summer, shortening the growing season, lead to mass starvation of billions. A recent study modeling the effects of a nuclear war estimated that an exchange between Russia and the US, in addition to hundreds of millions of immediate deaths, would kill 5 billion people worldwide after 2 years due to starvation brought on by the nuclear winter. The soot would take years to be eliminated and for normal growing season to return. Another talk would be for the people harmed in addition to in Japan, downwinders, mining, processing, and nuclear waste, but that will be another talk. Worldwide, over 12,000 bombs, nuclear weapons exist. Russia and the US have nearly 90% of the total. But there's a path out of this madness. A huge victory occurred July 7th, 2017, when 122 nations voted to adopt the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW. Tired of nuclear nations not fulfilling their pledge in the Non-Proliferation Treaty to work on nuclear disarmament, the non-nuclear nations negotiated this treaty, and the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, received the Nobel Prize for their groundwork. The treaty provides a path for nuclear nations to join. It's a humanitarian document that makes provisions to compensate victims and addresses the environment. First you prohibit, then you stigmatize, and eventually we will eliminate. And on January 22nd, 2021, 90 days after the 50th nation ratified the TPNW, it entered into force. Today, 92 nations have signed the treaty and 70 have ratified it. Of course, none of the 9 nuclear nations, including the US. Deterrence is supposed to save us. The more we spend, the safer we are. What about human error, computer error, cyber tech, misunderstanding, impaired leaders, and dangerous policies like having weapons on hair trigger alert? This is what Dan Ellsberg called the doomsday machine. Both Russia and the US have land-based missiles on hair trigger alert, ready to launch in under 15 minutes. And once launched, they can't be recalled. Now, our adversaries know the exact location of our 400 land-based missiles. So US war plans allow for launch on warning before even confirming a nuclear warhead has arrived. The president could be awakened in the middle of the night with only minutes to decide whether to authorize a nuclear response. But mistakes about incoming missiles have been made in the past, and fortunately we're caught on time. We lucked out. With launch on warning and hair trigger alert, is this how we blunder into nuclear war? Over 700 scientists recently sent a letter to President Biden and Congress to cancel the new, highly expensive Sentinel missile and to end land-based missiles altogether. These weapons are crazy dangerous. Deterrence is an unproven theory. Why are we spending trillions of dollars on them, and who is benefiting? Some universities profit from classified military research. Hopkins receives more than twice as much funding from the Department of Defense as any other university due to research at the Applied Physics Lab, much of it nuclear, like the controversial land-based Sentinel missile, despite the fact that the university's mission statement includes the call, quote, to bring the benefits of discovery to the world. Nuclear weapons manufacturers certainly profit. Here are the 6 biggest ones. And Northrop Grumman is the biggest of all with over $24 billion in contracts. Investment firms are making billions. Between 2020 and 2022, $747 billion was invested by over 300 institutions in 24 nuclear weapons producing corporations. All this is from ICAN, Don't Bank on the Bomb. Students figured out that the nuclear military industrial complex had some relationship to what was going on in Gaza. It was a report in the Baltimore Banner. Hopkins students protesting the war in Gaza researched the investment policies of Hopkins and the relationship between corporate support for the war in Gaza and the corporate profiting off nuclear weapons. This figured in their demands for university divestment, and this is really an amazing work that the students did. I've underlined the companies, the corporations they want to divest from, the ones that are not only involved in conventional weapons in Gaza, but also the nuclear weapons complex. BlackRock and Vanguard Investments, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and Lockheed Martin. And for those of us who have some money to invest, I really advise you to look at Don't Bank on the Bomb and guide in which investment companies are not invested in nuclear weapons. So, can a grassroots movement across the country make a difference educating the public and growing the call for abolition? Namely, the Back from the Brink campaign right now, bringing communities together to prevent the growing threat that nuclear weapons pose to our health, environment. There are 5 steps our government can do. Initiate multilateral negotiations with other 8 nuclear nations to eliminate nuclear weapons. Renounce first use. End presidential sole authority. Take nuclear weapons off hair trigger alert. And end the $1.7 trillion spending spree on nuclear weapons upgrades. 70 towns and cities, 6 counties, and 8 state legislative bodies have passed Back from the Brink, including the city of Baltimore, the city of Frederick, Montgomery County, Prince George's County. Now, Maryland General Assembly, this year we had a Back from the Brink resolution in both chambers. We spoke at hearings about the risk of nuclear war. Although it didn't get a vote, our sponsors have agreed to sponsor it again in 2025. If you want to help get your delegates and senators on board, state senators on board, please let me know, or I'd be so happy to help. In Congress, there's HRES 77 with 44 co-sponsors, 2 from Maryland. This resolution calls on the president to embrace the goals and provisions of the UN Treaty, TPNW, and to make nuclear disarmament the centerpiece of U.S. national security policy. It also calls on the U.S. to lead a global effort to move the world back from the brink of nuclear war. So, could public pressure make a difference? Could Back from the Brink become as broad and effective as a nuclear weapons freeze movement was when 1 million people marched in New York City June 12, 1982 for a verifiable, bilateral nuclear weapons freeze? There were more than 200 city council resolutions, 9 state legislatures passed resolutions endorsing the freeze movement. Could the arts today make a difference like it did in the 80s? The Day After movie, and if you haven't seen it, you really must. You can see it. I forget if it's YouTube, but you can watch the whole thing for free. Any rate, over 100 million viewers saw it and were terrified. And that really changed the awareness of the world, especially in the US, to what nuclear war would be. Was it the march? Was it the movie? Here Reagan signs the important Intermediate Range Missile Treaty, which may have prevented nuclear war from breaking out in Europe in 1987. Of course, those treaties have been abrogated, as John said. Could the arts today make a difference? And this is to you, Melvin. The book Oppenheimer, as we know, was turned into a movie that received 7 Oscars. Nuclear War by Annie Jacobson has just been published, a frightening, well-researched novel describing the first couple of hours after nuclear war. It may be turned into a movie. And just like maybe like the day after, it will make a difference. And the silent fallout, a lot of us just saw recently. It's a current documentary telling the story of American downwinders and the inspiring story of citizen scientists in St. Louis who collected baby teeth, found they contained strontium-90, that was from testing in Nevada, and published it. It created the public outrage that allowed President Kennedy to sign the atmospheric test ban. When Dr. Louise Rice died recently, there was a very interesting obituary, and Barry Commoner was part of that group in St. Louis. This is why I do this work. As the saying goes, treat the earth well. It was not given to you by our parents, but loaned to us by our children. Can we make a difference?
Thank you, Gwen. That was very informative and illuminating. I'm glad that you added that little section about the downwinder nuclear plant workers, because that's a perfect segue into what Linda's going to talk about. I would just like everyone to know that our committee not only works with Japanese hibakusha, but we work with radiation survivors all over the world. So we've worked with downwinders from Kazakhstan. We sent Lori Anderson, who's with the Navajo uranium miners. We raised money to send her with Dennis Nelson, who is a downwinder and part of our committee and who's on the call. So I'll be calling on Dennis a little bit later. But I want to introduce Linda Gunter because she's going to talk about some of these issues, the human costs and the environmental costs. And she's been doing yeoman's work making the connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, which is something that our committee has been doing since our inception in 1981. So Linda, if you can unmute yourself.
John,
Yes.
may I interrupt? Robin Lloyd has had her hand up for a long time and may have something significant that related to something that has happened before. Could we get a chance?
Yeah, Robin, you have something to say?
Well, no, actually, I don't know why my hand is up.
Okay. Okay, well, later on, I hope that you do talk because you're one of my sheroes up in Burlington, Vermont, and Robin did tremendous work back in the mobilization for survival days and the great protest in Central Park. So I'm just delighted that she's on. But let me go back to Linda, and Linda, if you can unmute, and we'll listen to you.
Did you push?
Hey, John, I think I am unmuted. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
So I'm speaking to you today from the nuclear-free city of Tacoma Park, Maryland, which actually just passed the Back from the Brink resolution last Wednesday. It took a couple of months, actually several months to get it done, but it's done. So we're going to add our name to that list. I'm going to preface my remarks today to say that while I do work at Beyond Nuclear, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, and that's because I'm going to touch on some political issues. And while we remember the heinous acts of August 6th and 9th, 1945, try to bring it into the present context. So, as they say, all opinions are my own. So today, almost 80 years after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first and only time nuclear weapons were used in war, but not the only time they've been used on human beings, there are still so many questions, debates, and myths about why the US bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The discussion about whether or not the US actually needed to drop the bombs at all has been well exercised, and you're probably familiar with the various arguments. It ended the war and saved American lives. That's the convenient narrative. But there is another far more compelling one, that A, the US needed to demonstrate the power of its bombs, and B, it did so to send a warning to Stalin. It's clear from unclassified documentation that after the bombing of Hiroshima, Japan's generals were willing to fight on. They'd seen worse casualties during the firebombing of Tokyo. And it's also clear that Japan surrendered when Stalin declared war, but that the country was preparing to face the inevitability of surrender regardless. So far from saving lives, what the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings achieved was to launch the Cold War and a nuclear arms race that has led to an untold death toll between the actual atomic tests that followed and the radioactive fallout that we all live with today. But let's return to why it was apparently so easy to annihilate other human beings in this way. To do that, we need to look forward to Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, all communities who do not look like us and where women, children, babies, the elderly were wiped out with impunity. In the same way, on those two fateful days, the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were simply non-combatants who were sacrificed to demonstrate the imperial power of a country that didn't even have an emperor. But we also need to look back at where the US sourced its uranium and where it tested its nuclear weapons. 80% of the uranium for the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs came from what is now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, then the Belgian Congo. Some came from Dene land in northern Canada. Later, it was mined domestically on Native American land. Again, we're looking mainly at communities of color and indigenous peoples. And of course, we just have to look at where the US tested its nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. Remember that terrible Merrill Eisenbud quote? While it is true that these people do not live the way Westerners do, civilized people, it is nevertheless also true that these people are more like us than mice. That's a US government official talking. He was the director of the US Atomic Energy Agency's Health and Safety Laboratory. It was another vile and immoral experiment, and the US government pretty much admitted it was. Here's what Eisenbud also said in 1956 of the people they left behind on Rongelap for 2 days after the March 1, 1954 Castle Bravo blast, before evacuating them, and who were returned there by the Americans just 3 years later, assured there was no further danger from radiation. Here's his quote. "That island is by far the most contaminated place on Earth, and it will be very interesting to get a measure of human uptake when people live in a contaminated environment." And of course, the US also tested its nuclear weapons on Western Shoshone land in Nevada. And then there are the proxy wars, where US conventional weapons do the killing, some tipped with depleted uranium, even if American soldiers aren't firing them, toppling governments in places like Chile and Guatemala, and of course, most horrifically today, in Gaza. There's an obvious pattern here, and it has a name, and that name is racism. Some of us are still in recovery, or maybe we will never be, from the truly heinous display on Capitol Hill on July 24th, a day that should live in infamy, just as August 6th and 9th should. We witnessed a war criminal, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, disgracefully embraced and applauded by members of our Congress, speak for an hour as if the genocide his government is perpetrating in Gaza wasn't happening. He never mentioned Palestinians by name because to Netanyahu, there are no Palestinians, only Hamas. So there, the collateral damage to rescue 4 Israeli hostages is 300 Palestinian lives. To take out one enemy, dozens more. The link here to everything that has gone before is dehumanization. It's what drove the new Americans to massacre Native Americans. It allowed for slavery, and it was rooted in Nazi Germany's elimination of Jews, gypsies, the disabled, and homosexuals. It worked during World War II, when the Japanese were painted literally as rats on posters and described as spiders, scorpions, and, said US General Joseph Stilwell, bow-legged cockroaches. This resulted in Americans cheering the dropping of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs and the persistent belief that this atrocity was somehow necessary. Similar tropes were used to dehumanize the Vietnamese people during the American war in their country, and today it is the turn of Palestinians, labeled Amalek, the people who, according to the Old Testament, must be wiped from the face of the earth. There is, of course, another genocide going on today that almost no one talks about, and it's happening in the Congo. And the Congo really provides the through thread for this whole story. When the US sourced uranium from the Congo for its atomic bombs, it did so undercover using spies and secret codes. Industrial diamonds was the term often substituted for uranium. Congo uranium, by far the richest uranium ore in the world, had to be clandestinely transported to the US because it was needed for the Manhattan Project, still so secret that almost everyone involved in the Congo operation had no idea what the uranium was actually for. The operation was also undercover and disguised because the biggest fear was that Nazi Germany might also try to plunder the Congo supply. And it was a fear grounded in reality because Germany did need that uranium. Perhaps Werner Heisenberg did know what he was doing and chose not to do it. Or maybe Germany did not get the bomb simply because it did not have access to a sufficient supply of high-grade uranium, although it's likely that they did indeed get their hands on at least some of the Congo supply already stored in Belgium. At any rate, Germany did not get anywhere close to making the bomb and surrendered before the US was ready to use theirs. And once it was, they needed to test it on someone, and so we know what happened next. But back in the Congo, the conditions under which uranium was mined at Shinkolobwe were appalling. Just as Native Americans were unprotected and uninformed in the US, so too were the Congolese. The uranium was king, and they were the expendable subjects. So coveted was Congo's uranium that, according to later revelations by an MI6 operative, the UK Foreign Intelligence Service, Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected prime minister after Congo got its independence, was assassinated in 1961, just months after coming to power, not only due to fears that he would lead the country into communism, but also over uranium. That's because no sooner was Lumumba elected than Katanga province, home to the Shinkolobwe mine, seceded from the country. Lumumba needed help to quell the rebellion, and finding none at the UN, eventually he turned to the Soviets. American and British intelligence feared Lumumba would hand over complete access of the Congo uranium to Khrushchev. His fate was sealed. But the US is not the only country that relied on the Congo for the survival of its nuclear weapons, and has done so, the survival of its nuclear weapons program. Israel has nuclear weapons and has done so since the late 1950s, even though incredibly it's still not officially recognized as a nuclear weapons state. In November 1968, when France stopped supplying uranium to Israel after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, Israel embarked on a daring scheme to get uranium out of the Congo, involving multiple countries, ships, and subterfuge. It was orchestrated by Mossad, the Israeli secret intelligence service, and included false flags, literally, and an exchange of ships and cargoes on the high seas. It came to be known as Operation Plumbat, since the illicit cargo was marked as lead. But what that cargo actually contained was an estimated 200 tons of uranium yellowcake. Once the ship docked at Haifa, and this was not the ship that had left the Congo, the uranium was transported to the Dimona reactor site where the country's nuclear weapons are made. It's quite the story, and I encourage you to look it up. Today, there is renewed interest in the Shinkolobwe mine and its uranium, not for nuclear weapons this time, but to feed the greed for yet more commercial nuclear power plants. China, Russia, and France all have their eyes on the Congo and its uranium, even though at least 6 million people have now died in the genocide there since the late 1990s. The factions and fighting mainly over the rich mineral supplies, these days most especially cobalt and coltan. Congo's people continue to suffer and die while Western powers greedily eye their mineral riches, just as they did in the 1940s and the 1960s. The people there don't matter and are allowed no voice, in the same way that the citizens of Hiroshima and Nagasaki rose one morning to go about their tasks as on any other day, only to discover that their lives were considered valueless. So when we mourn Hiroshima and Nagasaki today and this week and always, we must remember what their sacrifice represents: a loss of humanity, a loss of empathy, a calculated dehumanization of people painted as other or worse, a willingness to see evil and innocence in the faces of children in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the Congo, and in Gaza. You don't need a genocidal weapon to carry out a genocide, but the willingness of those who do it, and the willingness of those who accept it and who even applaud it, as our Congress did last month, makes all of your voices, the voices for peace, the most important voices that need to be heard in our present times. We had our moment of silence, but after that, we must take care of the people of the Congo, Sudan, Gaza, Bangladesh. We must raise our voices again, even louder, and call for decency, for kindness, and for peace. And I will just mention in closing that there have been some extraordinary scenes today that do tie all these stories together at the famous Hiroshima Dome. I can probably share my screen and show you maybe a couple of the pictures, but there's been a demonstration there. It's an anti-war demonstration, but it's also a protest against the presence of Israel at the Hiroshima Nagasaki Memorial. And that's one of the scenes of the crowd there. They've been, I think, fairly violently dispersed now by the police. But that's one picture. There's another one here, I think. I can show you. I try and get, oh, sorry, I'm not able to do it because the other one keeps popping back up. But anyway, you get the idea. So that's all I have to say, but I do think that it's important as we think about the past and always remember it, to put it in the context of the present and what it means to treat people as if they're not fellow human beings. and what that can lead to. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And we are so lucky that we're in the DC area. We have, resources like Linda and Gwen. Before I introduce Fan Yang, I just want to add a little bit of context to what you said. So the authorities understood perfectly well the risks of uranium mining. The uranium mining had been going on since the mid 1800s in Czechoslovakia. And there was enormous documentation about what the impact was. The lung cancer was probably the biggest impact from radon. There was no ventilation. They were down in the shafts. So this was documented. The uranium, the radium that Madame Curie got that killed her as well, came from those Czechoslovakian mines. So when they sent the Congolese miners down into the shafts, and then the Dene up in Saskatchewan, and then the Navajo, the Dene Navajo in the Southwest, they knew exactly and precisely that they were consigning them overwhelmingly to horrendous early deaths. It was absolutely cold-bloodedly deliberate. So Linda, you made that point, but I just wanted to emphasize that point that of how disregarding they were and they are of human lives in the interest of pursuing the resources of the majority of the world. And it hasn't stopped. Some estimates are that as many as 20 million Congolese have died over the last 25 years. Again, it's for lithium, cobalt, primarily cobalt, other resources that are needed. And in Congo, it's largely child labor that's doing the work so that we can drive our Teslas. So I want to introduce Fan Yang, and she's an economist. She specializes in international economics, so she knows very well about global inequalities, if you will. And she's not a nuclear expert. And I think it's very important that we have people, young people in particular, who are not nuclear experts, who can listen to those of us that are more experienced and to reflect on what they've heard. So if Fan Yang, if you can unmute, I'd like you to reflect a little bit on what you've heard and what your feelings are. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Wow. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in such a special event. It's my first time into this space, and yeah, every talk has been so powerful. I must confess, I'm a little bit overwhelmed right now. There's so many things. Let me just take a deep breath. Yeah, I will try to be brief and hope my sharing can contribute into deepening our commitment for the beautiful board. Our hard knows is possible. So the issues I heard, like the issues of nuclear weapon abolition or disarmament, that our dream and what we are fighting for is actually a wicked province. It involves economics, infrastructure, political economy, social psychologies, and various human entanglements and historical process. And thank you, Linda, for providing that story that I was not aware of. And these weak problems are inherently complex and lacking straightforward solutions or clear right or wrong answers. So I like to, in terms of reflection, offer one perspective among many, focus on economics, game theory, and governance to enhancing our understanding of this, vector problem. And some of them have some linkages with what Gwen and Linda has spoke. So in a very simple term, economics should be an expression of our collective choices. And governance is concerned how we make choices together for the better future. And the government, the nation state, use governance methods like voting and other participatory approaches to make policy decisions. Idealistically, ideally, aim to really maximize the well-being of the greatest number of life. So in a well-functioning state and open society, a nation's decision should reflect the deepest desire of its peoples and communities, inside that border and beyond, because we are interconnected. And it needs to be pro-social and pro-life. But throughout the human history, a utilitarian view of life, whether it is towards a nature or other, nation state or social groups, has led to ecological crisis. We had 2 brutal world wars last century and persistent inequalities, in our modern history. So we must recognize and address these patterns. So let's start with economics. So economics is about, supply and demand. And in supply and demand economics, there can be a perverse incentives to manufacture demand for weapons in wars and conflicts to maintain lucrative supply chain like the military industrial complex, including these research institutions. So it's a very, very, disturbing, uncomfortable, fact, but there are peoples, companies, and government profiting from the war, from others' miseries. We have to, just acknowledge that. So next, let's explore game theory. So which game theory analyzes a situation where parties, like different people, agents, make interdependent decisions. It helps explain the dynamics of the arms race, a competition between nations to, let's say, possess the most powerful weapons. So the proliferation of nuclear weapons actually really reflects this great human predicament where, there's a lack of trust. Because of lack of trust, there's, what we call multipolar trap, where, each country acts on the near-term self-interest and end up diminishing the long-term sustainability of the integrated whole, the planet. So the same dynamics are at the root of, Gwen, you mentioned also about, climate change. And also, and the tragedy of commons. So no one wants a nuclear war, then why we keep making the weapons? What is this, weird, driving force towards the race to bottom or all lose scenarios? Nobody wins. So, country A may think, I need to make nukes because country B and country C are making it. Country B may think, I need to make nukes because country C and D are making, so I need to build a more sophisticated version of the weapon that overcomes your, defense. I need to use my weapon to attempt to win the arms race. So this is underlying psyche. And it is basically, it is a psychological trap and forces that drive us to make an unconscious choice. So now with AI, actually, AI has been, deployed in weapons and various means to kill people, kill life instantly. And the fast-growing technology of 21st century calls for urgent need for matching explosion of wisdom, and compassion and love to use the technology properly to protect and serve life. And to me, I'm definitely echo with all of you, this, possessing the nuclear weapon is a civilization heading towards a self-destruction. So fundamentally, I really think our decision-making or choice-making apparatus is broken. We have a coordination failures for many entrenched global, challenges. So how can we collectively make wise decisions and live well together? This is a core of governance, how we define good and make a good decisions. So the vast majority of the most consequential and difficult problem we face, beyond this, nuclear wars, species extinctions and climate change are the unintended outcomes of human beings attempting to solve other problems. So, I think Tamura-san, you already mentioned that, basically in our efforts to end the World War II, for example, we invented these nuclear weapons, which did play a role in ending the war, but really, deliver humanity into such a far more insecure future. So how can we consider this, externalities? What does it mean to have a more participatory, process to ensure those, big national level, international decision can resonate with all parties involved, or even is a win-win-win, solution ever possible? Is that always some party has to lose? What are the fruitful conditions for such solutions? I really think, at the different levels, we need to ask fundamentally different questions and not be intimidated by the lack of easy answers. So, or, encourage industry to rush into solutions to make money off. So the horrible, events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki definitely left us such a scar on human history. And Tamura-san, when I listened to your embodied experience, it's just so powerful. Like it really shook me to the core. And it's also important to remember that before Hiroshima, in Nagasaki, Japanese military aggression caused immense sufferings with devastating impact on China, my home country, and other Asian countries. And this reflection is not about assigning blame or compare tragedies, but recognize that in wars, every single person, every single nation suffers and losses. So understanding this shared, human pain can help us working towards a future where such sufferings, basically, we are using human beings as a means to an end, or building up prosperity upon others' unhappiness and misery. And that is can never, repeat it. So there are policy level interventions, and Gwen, you mentioned about that. I'm not an expert to, to present, but I can say at an individual level, we can do something to contributing to creating the right social climate, social dynamics, and incentives. Maybe the better word, incentive is more like economics term, but a better word is inspiration. Inspiration to really, create this, collective, effective choice. I really think it's really about choice. So remember in the very beginning, I mentioned about how the vector problem have no easy or linear solutions. So we never know how each sincere actions can create an impact or morphic resonance in the complex living system named, society. And personally, I really believe no one dies in vain, and every death contributes into elevating the human consciousness. So to simplify it, I have one to do and one not to do. So for to do, it's very individually, and how can we really practice radical inclusion? What radical inclusion will look like, and can be practiced with integrity and courage. And can we have an unconditional acceptance and hold space for the people around us, for whoever will label as others or enemies? Linda, you mentioned about the, dehumanizations. Can we really find a common ground for those, especially those, people that hurt us and frustrate us. And, we do not need to agree with them, but can we hold them, within loving compassion? That's one to do. Personally, I want to commit to. And one not to do is really release the hatred in all aspects of life, not contributing to the collective energy field that escalated to manifest as a wars. My grandma always said, I grew up with my grandparents, say like, whenever I get upset, and she'll say like, you are contributing to the energy field of being upset and angry. And that, who knows, kind of manifest in the other side of the world to become, wars. So we are all connected in this, this like a collective, intelligence. So deeper within, that's a very, Buddhist way to expand the life. So, do not, dehumanize anyone. And what if, there are no good or evil people? What if it's as a matter of, there are happy or unhappy people? So how can we create a social condition for the best human quality to strive, starting with us and our family and friend circle? So, and more, I find the tremendous value of leaving questions and appreciating the inquiries. And I think, such curiosities and inquisitive mind will find a space to overtake the judgment I hold against others and some leaders, and allow for the changes of heart and changes of the world. And in the end, I think that's much more powerful than economic or military force that, very detect, the world. So yeah, I really want to believe, in the end, love gonna win. And, my commitment is really become a embodiment of love and wisdom, and really do what I can do in my own capacities. So I really want to, thank you again for all the sharing and this beautiful space for me to really, redetermine, like how I want to live my life, what kind of values, I want to embody. And thank you so much for your beautiful soul to really, really extend your care, deep care and compassion, to the people we never met from the past, and also, to the children's. Gwen, like your last picture is very, very beautiful. It's really for us and for the, future. I really want to be a, responsible, caring ancestors, for the future generations. So thank you very much.
Fan Yang, I want to say that your talk was very inspirational to me. Your insights, your solutions. What I got out of it is we need to share, but we need to find trust in each other to get away from this zero-sum game. And I want to say that when you write your book, I will be the first one to purchase that book. So I cannot wait until you publish your book, because you have so much to say. So, and I want to say one more thing to you, and that is the Hibakusha have, this is one of their most important mottos, and that is no more Nanking, no more Pearl Harbor, no more Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the Hibakusha are very, very aware of the atrocities that the Japanese government carried out, as Hideko said in her introduction. So they're just, we've got to get away from this zero sum and these atrocities and so on. So I want to thank you again. So we're going to go to question and answer, and the first person I call on is going to be Jim Wagner, because Jim had a lot to say about your talk. But Jim, before I call on you, I want to ask Dennis Nelson to say a few words while he's still on. So Dennis is a downwinder from St. George, Utah. So when the Nevada test site would explode their weapons, they would deliberately wait until the wind was not blowing toward Las Vegas and not toward Salt Lake City, or a reverse wind that was blowing toward Los Angeles. They would wait until it was blowing out to nowhere. And St. George, Utah, and Cedar City, Utah was their nowhere. And so the people of St. George and Cedar City and that part of Utah received, the overwhelming brunt of the immediate fallout from the bombs. And the stories that they tell are very similar to the stories that we hear from the survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So Dennis, I want to introduce you and just say a few words about your experience, and then I'm going to go to Jim because I want him to talk about what we just heard. Dennis.
Thank you, John. As John mentioned, I grew up in St. George, Utah, which was directly downwind of the Nevada test site. I came from a family of 7, 2 parents and 5 children. And my father and mother both died of cancer. My brother, my younger brother, and my youngest sister died of cancer, and I myself have had cancer and been treated and survived. But the point is that St. George was deliberately targeted. Well, maybe it was the one that had the least possibility of harm to the fewest people. I don't know, but the fallout clouds were directed over my hometown. And I lived there through the 1950s. In 1951, January 27th, the first bomb was dropped in Nevada, and the fallout clouds came over St. George. Then in 1953, there were a whole series of tests, and the fallout clouds once again landed on St. George. And there were people in St. George who had Geiger counters who were out prospecting for uranium that actually staked claims on hotspots that were fallout hotspots, that there was no uranium there, but they thought they were going to get rich, and they staked claims. But it turned out that was a kind of a fool's errand. The problem with the fallout was that although it was toxic and it caused cancer, it didn't happen immediately. It happened months and years and even decades later. So the government could deny that there was any connection between the fallout. In 1953, during this heavy fallout, there were a group of sheepmen who took their sheep out onto the range east of the Nevada test site and west of Cedar City. And during that test time, some of these herds of sheep that came back to Cedar City had very high number of deaths. Over 1,000 sheep died, over maybe 4,000 total. And most of those were newborns, because they came back to lamb in Cedar City, and most of the newborns died. But later on, the sheepmen sued the federal government for the loss of the sheep, and they said that it was because of fallout. And the government attorneys in the civil division from Justice Department came in and defended the government against this lawsuit, and they suggested that the sheep died because of poor range conditions and not because of fallout. But they also did an obstruction of justice by withholding reports from Hanford, where they had taken artificial fallout, which was really what was left after they produced plutonium. All of the isotopes that were produced in the fission process, which is really what fallout is. They used that and they treated sheep with this artificial fallout, and the sheep had exactly the same symptoms that the range sheep had from tests in Nevada. And that was such a blatant obstruction of justice on the part of the government, because they had hidden these reports, which would have proved that the fallout did cause it. And so the judge ruled that there was no effect of fallout, and he did not give them any compensation. So they got no money at all. And then 10 years later, there was a class action lawsuit where they all were 13 different kinds of cancer, or 21 plaintiffs alleged that fallout had caused their cancers and deaths. And in that case, the judge awarded damages to 13 different kinds of cancer, saying that that was indeed caused by fallout. But at that point, 10 years later, the government attorneys appealed it to the appellate court in Denver. The appellate court ruled that yes, these were possibly caused by fallout, these cancers, but the government couldn't be held responsible because there's a doctrine called the what is it? Anyway, it's a doctrine that the king can do no wrong. Basically, if a government does an action deliberately, it's the exemption in the Federal Tort Claims Act that if a government does something deliberately, it cannot be held responsible. And so they overturned it, and once again, the human class action lawsuit received no money. Later on, their attorney appealed that appellate court decision to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court refused to hear it. And the Chief Justice, who was named Warren Burger, recused himself from that decision to hear on the basis that he was involved earlier in this lawsuit when he was a attorney for the Department of Justice. And so once again, they got no more money. They got no money. And and there's a twist to that. There was an involvement of the federal government in this lawsuit. Richard Nixon, who was then vice president, conspired with Warren Burger as the attorney in the Justice Department to cover this up, to prevent any knowledge of danger or health effects from fallout from becoming public. And then, so when they appealed this to the Supreme Court, Warren Burger had been appointed by his co-conspirator, the Vice President of the United States, Richard Nixon, as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So there's nothing new about what's happened in the Supreme Court recently. That has been a kind of a disaster with giving the president full immunity from whatever he's doing. The Supreme Court seems to go through these phases of obstructing justice and then trying to do better and then obstructing justice some more. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that my family have all died at an average age of 53. Not all of us, but the four that have died at the average age of 53. So there's no question in my mind that there's a huge effect of fallout and radiation, including nuclear reactors and other peaceful uses of atomic energy. They're not safe. And so we need to do something to eliminate these dangers from our our world. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dennis. And I just want to make sure everybody gets this. So the government deliberately killed them, but we're not responsible because it was deliberate. So
Exactly.
yeah,
Isn't that a kick in the
yeah.
head?
And this is actually typical of the way that the whole nuclear issue has been addressed over the years. And the Hibakusha have a similar story. They finally got some compensation, just like the downwinders did, but it was not enough. It was, I mean, Dennis can tell you another time that he got some money, but it was nowhere near enough to cover the health expenses
But that came from
suffered because of
legislation, not from the judiciary.
that came from
The courts
right,
did nothing. It was actually the legislature that provided the RICA compensation.
right, but the compensation was definitely inadequate to say the least for the suffering. So I'd like to thank you for that, Dennis. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask people to raise their hand. We've got about another 30 minutes or so. So comments, questions are greatly appreciated. If you can keep them to within, say, 2 or 3 minutes, that would be appreciated too. And I'm going to let Jim Wagner start because he had some really interesting comments about Fan Wang's presentation. So Jim, why don't you start, and then people raise their hand and I'll recognize you.
Well, thanks, John, for giving me the spotlight. Yeah, I've been thinking about the issue for years now. It's complex, as Fan Young pointed out. However, I think we can start to break it down into some sectors anyway. Before I get into those sectors and the basic parts of the problem, I wrote some notes here as Dennis was talking, because I hadn't planned to present tonight, but I have 4 major points that I think are important, and I can fade some of this in the chat. So number 1 here, I've got, we need to continue educating the public. I think there's a sense, at least in the United States, that the nuclear threat is over. But as we all know here, the opposite is true. We've never been closer. So we got to continue our education of the masses on this, and never forget these atrocities, the bombings, the testing, and the legacy radiation from that, the effects on the workers, all of it. So never forget it. Keep it out there, and get the word out that things have deteriorated. The Cold War did not end this threat, and we're closer now, as we all know. And then number 2, I said, and related to that, the nuclear arms control regime is hanging on by a thread, as John mentioned. The last remaining treaty, the New START treaty, it's set to expire, I think it's either January or early February of 2026. Russia has already stopped allowing inspections of its facilities. So they are maintaining the limits under the treaty, the warhead limits, and deployed warheads. But I guess it's deployed warheads that's specifically part of that treaty. However, given the state of tensions with Russia, I think it's very doubtful that well, it's perilous. So in my thinking on this recently, and actually the recent PBS showing of television event, which was about the day after that Gwen mentioned, that movie that affected Reagan, that TV show a few months ago also talked about the nuclear freeze movements of the early 80s. So putting it all together, I'm convinced that we don't have time for complicated treaties, to put it bluntly. I think our best bet for progress is to advocate for a renewed nuclear freeze. The idea that we had in the early 80s, and I lived through that, I was part of that. So the idea is to freeze and then negotiate for reductions. But we have the complicating factor now of missile defense systems. As John also pointed out, they were prohibited under the ABM treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And however, that treaty was abrogated, I think it was 2002, by George W. Bush and Putin. Both wanted to pursue these missile defense systems, which are, as John pointed out, destabilizing. They give the holder of such a system, if it ever worked, a first strike capability. You could launch a strike and then you could shoot down the retaliatory strike. So it seems to me we need a multi-pronged approach overall, and we need a two-pronged approach regarding nukes and these missile defense systems. That is, it seems to me the most logical priorities at this point would be to advocate for a freeze and in the nuclear weapons production, and to call for a return to the ABM treaty. And both of those measures have to be comprehensive to now include all the nuclear powers. Things are much more complicated than they were in the early 80s. So my third point, and I'll finish up, as I said in the chat, call out this military industrial congressional complex, which many of us in the US know about. So this has been infiltrating our economics for a long time. It was actually called out by Dwight Eisenhower on his last day of office. However, it's persisted. And I think Gwen mentioned some contractors, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon. These are big economic players in the US. We have to minimize their significance. And it seems to me the way to try to do that is to try to build local, sustainable, clean communities, getting back to some core values of universal love, our families, and support for our communities. If we could keep things local and not rely on the jobs and money from these defense contractors, I think that is a way to counter their influence. Of course, we have to, at the same time, try to break up this complex and call them out, these defense contractors and the politicians, the Congress people who get money from them, and there are many.
Yes.
And number four, I've covered most of it. So that was the local communities. And I put here as my last comment, kick the MIC out of our communities. So that's my thinking. I haven't put it into a treatise, but I think the situation is complicated, but I think if we try to break it down logically, those are some major points, at least it seems to me. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Jim. And I'll buy your book too. So,
okay. Yeah.
so
Don't hold your breath.
So right. So just reflecting on what Jim said. So the U.S. government last month announced that in 2026 they are going to deploy intermediate range missiles in Germany. So it's taken us back to 1981 and the intermediate range missiles being deployed, and Russia is perfecting their hypersonic missiles, and it's we need to struggle on all levels. And I think the most important thing that we can do is to educate ourselves. And I think we're doing a really good job of that here. So I'd like to recognize SC, but I don't know who SC is. So if you can unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and then if you can speak for a couple minutes, SC.
Oh, hello. Can everybody hear me well?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, we
great.
can.
Great. This is Sarah from Quebec, Canada. So we have quite a few Canadian participants today. Yeah, well, just now I did a little research online. I found out that beside Hiroshima and Nagasaki, US had considered dropping the terrible bombs on a few other Japanese cities, including Kokura and Niigata. It's probably no coincidence that most of the cities under consideration at the time were those located on the west coast of Japan. So the side of Japan facing Russia and China. Naturally, the US would like to keep the residual contamination as far away from us in North America as possible. At the same time, as one of the speakers said earlier, the US wanted to send it out as a warning sign to the former Soviet Union, so it makes sense. But apparently, the toxins did flow out of the Sea of Japan. The effects of nuclear fallout and radiation might actually go as far as Australia and beyond. I personally know such a blood cancer survivor who later became an Australian doctor, professor, and active advocate against nuclear weapons. I think he's a member of what's the IPPNW? I cannot remember exactly the full name. Yeah, so it's his story, and I was once his student. So yeah, it's such a tragedy. We cannot keep it just because, okay, we bomb this, this spot is targeted, this is enemy's territory. But in the end, pretty much all individuals on Earth, round and round, would be affected in the long run. Yeah, that's what I would like to share.
Thank you, Sarah. So I don't see any hands. I want people to think about saying something and show your hand. But while we're in Canada, let's ask Brother Christopher to say a few words. Christopher?
Sure thing. Okay. First of all, I'd like to know I have two questions. What are China and India, which both have nuclear weapons, doing to try and reduce, to do away with those nuclear weapons altogether? And the second question I have is what since that treaty has been signed in 2017 to reduce to reduce nuclear weapons, is Iran part of that nuclear treaty or not? And also, are they still stockpiling nuclear weapons, or are they trying to destroy their nuclear weapons? So in the event that if these weapons are ever used several years from now, hope to God they're not. If they're trying to make sure that these weapons will never be used again, nuclear weapons will be used on cities to try and to destroy major cities. And also, is North Korea increasing the use of nuclear weapons, and if so, are they making plans to test those nuclear weapons in the near future?
So Gwen, I'm going to ask you, let me take a little bit of it, and then I'm going to ask you to talk about the ban treaty a little bit more. So the nations that have nuclear weapons are the United States, Russia, Britain, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. So none of those nations are, to my knowledge, are making any effort whatsoever to reduce their weapons. Some of them, for example, China has a pretty robust no first use policy, but all of them pretty much, as far as I know, are continuing to build their arsenals, and particularly China is quote, modernizing its arsenal, and the United States is spending tens of trillions of dollars, basically planning to completely rebuild their entire system. And of course, Russia is doing the same. So none of them are taking any real action. And you've got, you have Israel has several hundred sophisticated nuclear weapons. India and Pakistan each have probably fewer than 100, but the tensions between those two countries are very, very high. It's kind of a a low boil state of war between those two countries. And then you've got North Korea has probably several dozen primitive nuclear weapons. And the point is that none of them have signed on to the ban treaty, and none of them, to my knowledge, are making any effort to get rid of their bomb. The only country that did, by the way, was South Africa. So, Gwen, can you talk a little bit about the ban treaty?
Okay, so the ban treaty actually, U.S. Through NATO did whatever it could to, I don't know if you can say sabotage the meetings that were happening in 2017 and sending out notes to other nations to not participate. Despite that, there have been some NATO nations that have attended the meeting of parties of the treaty. So Christopher, the treaty would prohibit everything about nuclear weapons for those nations that have signed it: transporting, sharing, developing, and certainly any use or testing. So it's a total prohibition. And but none of the NATO nations or nations under Russia's umbrella, nuclear umbrella, have signed it. I did have this slide. The idea is you prohibit, you stigmatize, and eventually you eliminate. The U.S. has not signed a whole lot of treaties that we somewhat respect. There are interesting developments. I think it's in Australia. The Prime Minister personally is a fan of the treaty, and a couple of the nations did participate at the meetings of parties of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the meetings that happened in November of 2023. But the nations with nuclear weapons presently, the 9 nations, they're all, part of developing and modernizing their forces. China does have a no first use policy, but there's concern that, being pushed by U.S. and Russian developments, they will change that. The U.S. expenditure is not trillions; it's $2 trillion is the estimate in the modernizing of all parts of the triad. What haven't I answered? But like I said, the treaty's growing. It's only been since 2017, and 72 nations, what I say, 70 nations have ratified it, and over 90 nations have signed it. So it's really real, and the hope is that it, with the Back from the Brink, Back from the Brink campaign, if there was enough public pressure for our elected officials to one by one begin to support it, just as 44 members of Congress have, that we could get to a point where there could be at least multilateral nuclear negotiations, nuclear negotiations.
So basically, North Korea has no interest in nuclear negotiation to try and that they're stockpiling their nuclear weapons. Which I'm assuming is right. They're doing that. So they're not interested in any nuclear negotiation to try and reduce the nuclear weapons that they have at the present.
Yeah, well, we don't know anything about North Korea. We can support, but there's not much, transparency. But you can't say that any of the nuclear nations are doing anything. None of them are doing anything positive. And North Korea, is an example, I think, of, you know, how can you even talk about deterrence when you have unstable leaders in countries that possess nuclear weapons? Not North Korea is not the only one with unstable leaders.
Right.
Right. I can think of plenty of unstable leaders. So I'm going to ask Linda to say a few words, and she's going to talk about this issue. I'd like to say that Argentina had a nuclear weapons program back in the early 80s under the dictatorship, but when democracy was restored, that they abolished it as well. But you know, the point is that they're in Japan. I think Linda can talk a little bit about Japan having a bomb on the shelf. I've heard this from the A-bomb survivors over and over, that Japan could develop a bomb in a year, in a few months' time. There's probably 5 or 6 or more industrial nations that could do it very quickly. We have a slogan with our committee is that every nuclear reactor is a potential bomb factory. So Linda, can you talk a little bit about the topic?
Well, what I was going to add really was what you touched on, Gwen, which is, of course, this business of deterrence, the myth of deterrence. To me, that's the cornerstone of everything that deters us from being able to get true abolition done, because there's just this buy-in that somehow, I mean, in this room, it sounds like insanity, which it is, which is somehow having nuclear weapons makes you safer than not having them. I mean, we all know that if there are no nuclear weapons in the world, that's obviously the safest answer. But there's this, priesthood. They come here actually into DC every year and have their nuclear deterrence summit. And I've been once. That was enough, to listen to this sort of this ability to talk about using nuclear weapons and needing nuclear weapons and a missile gap with Russia. It's like being in the movie of Dr. Strangelove, honestly. But it's a priesthood that believes in this absolutely intrinsically, will argue with you forever on that. And so that to me is the number one job, is to bust the myth of deterrence, because until we do that, we just can't move forward. And it's a difficult argument to make. We have actually on our website a pamphlet called about breaking the myth of deterrence, and your head starts to go round when you make the argument. What do people believe? Do they believe you are going to use them or you're not going to use them? But in the end, what's clear is that nuclear weapons are not weapons. And they're certainly not weapons if they're so dangerous you can never use them. That's the argument. They're so dangerous that no one would actually use them, so therefore they're a deterrent. And we've got to attack that constantly, because that's in the way of this idea of, it's prestigious and I'll be safer if I develop them. And of course, the destabilization that we're seeing in so many places. I mean, what's extremely worrying to me is what's going on in the Middle East region right now with a country like Iran, who is moments away from having a nuclear weapon, a country like Israel that's deciding to, lob missiles across its borders, including into Iran and Syria and Lebanon. Will this escalate at some point into a nuclear exchange? When you talk about the madman theory, hopefully we won't have one in the White House. Hopefully we won't have a man in the White House, let alone a madman, but we'll see what happens. But that's a real liability. That's where deterrence immediately breaks down, of course. It can't cater for that. The thing about deterrence is that it has to be 100% successful. That's not going to happen. So that to me is job number one for all of us, is to just really hammer away on the myths of deterrence. And I'll see if I can put a link to the pamphlet while you continue the discussion. Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
John?
Yes.
I just wanted to mention my website. It's called Support and Education for Radiation Victims. And it's the address, URL is www.serv.org. And it's got a lot of good information about the effects of radiation on health and a lot of reference material and bibliography.
Put it in the chat, please, Dennis.
I did. I put it in the chat.
Thanks.
So I'd just like to comment that And Caldecott talked about this a little bit in her book, Nuclear Madness. Intrinsically, nuclear weapons are first strike weapons. And the idea is that, if you're the second one to use them, it's too late. You've already been destroyed. And that's the whole idea of, deterrence. But we need to remember that intrinsically, they are first strike weapons. They are use them or lose them. Herbert Kahn wrote a book about it. I mean, Kissinger and the other, Dr. Strangelove characters, talked about that. And that's one of the reasons why, we need to get rid of them, because they are so destabilizing. What I'm going to do is, I don't see any. Do I see? Gwen has a hand up. Fan Yang has a hand up. So Fan Yang, why don't you go first, and then Gwen, you go, and then I'm going to call on Ellen Thomas to kind of wrap things up. So Fan Yang.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I have an inquiry. What if having this nuclear weapon for certain country is a trauma response? Like, for example, North Korea, and again, speak for my country, China, because, modern history is, very bullied, by a lot of empirical force by holding that. I do think there's a trauma response. But then the question is like, how can we heal? How can we really collective heal? Is that, like the social healing is, to me, it's necessary, when we talk about the disarmament, because the social fabric of the trust, is not there, the international geopolitics. So what can we do as commoners to, heal together in all countries, all nations, all peoples? So that's my inquiry.
So I would say this, that you're correct about China. China for 30 years had at best a rudimentary nuclear program. I mean, for example, their missiles were liquid fueled missiles, which to actually fire one takes a day of preparation, and they were very clearly intended as a deterrent. And I think that small nations look at, for example, Libya. Libya got rid of its weapons of mass destruction, and what happened? It was absolutely and totally destroyed, and basically it is a non-functioning nation with open slave markets today. Or Iraq. And Iraq essentially got rid of all of its weapons of mass destruction, and we know what happened to Iraq. So this lesson is not lost on smaller nations, and this is a big, big problem, and it needs to be understood. It needs to be addressed, and we have the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but the test ban treaty was because the last 4 or 5 of the NPT conferences, every 5 years, there's a review conference at the UN, and people come from all over the world, and activists come from all over the world, and basically the last 4 or 5 times, they've more or less collapsed because the nuclear powers are not abiding by their obligation to pursue nuclear disarmament with all haste, and they're not doing that. And the potential nuclear weapons countries, see that, and so the incentive is there, very clearly there, for them to develop nuclear weapons, because the idea would be, well, we've got a nuke, and therefore we're not going to be invaded and destroyed. It's a big, big, big problem, and I'm glad that you brought that up. So I'm going to swing it over to Gwen now, and then Richard.
Just quick. So, and I don't have an answer to the question about intergenerational trauma, and I was trying to quickly look up, there was a really good presentation by an Israeli and a Palestinian who both lost families, and they have an amazing TED talk about intergenerational trauma. It doesn't excuse anything that the Israeli government has done, but it does address the issue of intergenerational trauma. What I wanted to bring up is RECA, especially with Dennis here. So that's Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And there's been a move to not only extend it, which it was allowed to the program to die in last month, but expand it to other states that are downwinders. And interestingly, it's a bilateral move. Josh, I think his name is Hawley, is senator in Missouri, and Missourians are downwinders. And so he's been trying to push for it. So both Republicans and Democrats passed it in the Senate, and it hasn't passed in the House. And the hope is it'll come up again. So RECA not only should be extended, but it should be expanded. And the whole discussion of it is really important for people to understand what Dennis is telling us, how many people in our own country have been harmed by nuclear weapons. And nobody even knows this, not to mention the people in the Marshall Islands and other islands and Australians. Anyway, so RECA.
RECA expansion has passed in the Senate, but it's been blocked in the House by Speaker Johnson. He has absolutely said, no, we're not going to do it. It costs too much. So it's just languishing, and the former RECA has expired. So there's nothing there now.
But the hope is that, maybe I'm too naive. It passed in the Senate. If there's a movement, and it would have to be, I guess, in the next Congress. It depends on who's in the House, who gets voted into the House next year.
But if it costs too much, what is the overall cost of the whole worldwide contamination with radioactive fallout?
Yeah,
and bomb testing. It's crazy. It must be huge.
Yes, indeed. So I want to recognize Dick Oakes. Dick is one of our local activists for many, many, many years. Dick.
Hello, folks. Responsible Statecraft and other sources have just announced that Ukraine has disabled Russia's ICBM, that's their intercontinental ballistic missile radars that they use for defense. Ukraine has disabled with drones 2 of the 3 defensive sites, and the third one was not hit by because it failed. If we blind Russia, Putin has already said, even before the invading Ukraine, that he has to interpret any incoming missiles as a first strike. This is very dangerous, and Responsible Statecraft has said this is the dumbest thing that Ukraine could ever do. So I think we should tell our Congress people to put restrictions on the targeting, the long distance targeting by Ukraine's military. That's all.
Thank you, Dick. So it's 9 o'clock now. So what I'd like to do is to turn the program over to Ellen for her final words, and then we'll close the program. So Ellen? Ellen, by the way, is the founder of Proposition 1. She was one of the founders of the White House Vigil. She is the policy director of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She's just an absolute dynamo. So Ellen, can you kind of wrap things up for us?
Fortunately, I don't like to talk long, so I can do that fairly quickly. It's just wonderful to see everybody here, and I am so grateful to the wonderful speakers. And John, you did a terrific job with that, getting the speakers. I was hoping to go to DC this week, and I was going to leave in the morning, but I've been exposed to COVID, and I'm not going to take COVID anywhere with me. So I have decided that I have to cancel that trip. I plan to join the WILPF US DMV meeting by Zoom if that's possible. I was planning on going up to Massachusetts and Vermont to start the process of launching a voter initiative campaign in 2025 to put warheads to windmills on the ballot wherever possible. So I'm announcing right now the Warheads to Windmills National Voter Initiative Campaign. And I have an RV to use. I'm going to drive around the country in the spring and summer, and I want invitations to come and talk to people. It's just fabulous to see you all. But we've been on here now for a long time, so probably everybody's ready to take a break. And I hope to see you all again soon. God bless you.
Thank you, Ellen. And I just want to remind everyone who lives in the DC area that on the 8th, which I believe is Thursday, is that right, Ellen? Thursday's the 8th?
Yeah.
So on the 8th, we are going to be meeting at the White House at 9:45. And I know that Women's International League is having a meeting at a Japanese restaurant. Tara, I think, could you announce that for me, please?
Yes, well, I'm very sad to hear that, Ellen, you won't be coming to DC because that was the whole reason. We usually have our local WILPF meetings every second Monday of the month at 4 p.m. We made an exception for Ellen's visit, and I'm also sad to say that the owner of the restaurant, her sister unexpectedly passed away, and so we're probably gonna end up having the meeting mostly virtually for those who want to join, and then also at the headquarters of the Women's Institute for Freedom of the Press. Martha Allen has agreed to host instead of Mita Ethio-Japanese Cafe. For those of you who are here in unceded Piscataway territory, go check it out. Go support a local Black woman-owned business. I'll put the information for the meeting in the chat.
Thank you, Tara. And then send me an announcement, and I'll let people know the change. And by the way, just so people know this, I have a long history with the Piscataway Indian Nation, and the son-in-law of Chief Tyack died last week, and I was over in Charles County this morning for his memorial, for Richard's memorial. So I've worked with the Piscataway Indian Nation for over 40 years. So on that note, let's end the meeting, and I want to thank everybody, all of the participants and all of the people who tuned in, and let's maintain the struggle. Let's listen to the Hibakusha, take inspiration. We've got a lot of work to do, and I appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Bye.
Yes, thanks a lot. Have a good evening.
Thanks for your questions.